All right, so this is going to be the second episode of the evolution series. And what we'll be doing in this episode is we're just going to be going over a number of the terms and definitions behind certain concepts in the evolutionary discourse. And a lot of these definitions will be quite useful in later episodes. So I decided to just have an entire episode just dedicated to these words. And so the first of which is evolution, right? So evolution, kind of as a broad definition, means just change over time, right? So in terms of biology, it generally refers to descent with modification, which is the idea that present day species change in terms of form, in terms of functionality, into kind of newer species, and that these changes are occurring on a gradual level. And so one of the major things to note here is that there are really two kind of understandings of evolution, right? The first of which is changes in allele frequencies over time. And so that is seen as a fact, and pretty much no one contests that, right? So something like bacteria gaining antibiotic resistance, that is something that, once again, there really is no controversy in terms of claiming that something has evolved or a species has evolved, right? But then there's also this other definition of evolution that is a bit more convoluted. It's a bit more sophisticated than simply descent with modification. And what that definition of evolution entails, it has to do something with the origin of a species' life. And so whether that be universal common ancestry, whether that be the tree of life or the forest of life, and there's a number of different names for these, but it's important to note that these are two distinct kind of understandings of evolution. And it's really important to know that the way that the word evolution is being used is highly contingent, or it's highly dependent on what context it's being used in, right? And so what's often seen in a lot of these evolutionary debates is that you have what's known as the equivocation fallacy, where you're using the same word, but you're denoting two completely different understandings or definitions of that word. So what's often the case is that when it comes to debates on evolution, they're equivocating the more simpler form of evolution with this more sophisticated understanding. And because of that, there's a lack in clarity in between how one is construing their arguments. Now, another important dichotomy is with regards to microevolution and macroevolution. This is somewhat controversial, as not everyone truly accepts this kind of dichotomization. But just for the sake of the discussion, the way microevolution is defined is by saying that microevolution is these small changes that occur within a species, and that these things are, again, they're quite like observational. There's no complexity or there's no controversy when it comes to these kinds of evolutionary adaptations. But then when it comes to macroevolution, that's often defined as large scale changes that can eventually lead to new species occurring in of themselves. And so what we see from that is that this definition is how many people understand macroevolution in terms of creating new body plans, creating higher categories of organisms. And so this really includes like the emergence of newly like structures that have formed that were not previously found, or the divergence of one kind of creature into a completely different kind altogether. And yeah, so like I said, evolution is essentially microevolution, but just done through a very long span, right? So the idea and the reason why this is controversial is because the mainstream view is that macroevolution, although it leads to speciation, it's just an accumulation of microevolution. So these small changes are occurring and they're happening over time in such a numerable amount that it eventually leads to macroevolution. This is a great area of contention with regards to some of the skeptics towards evolution, and they would argue that microevolution cannot account for macroevolution. And so we'll take a look at this in more detail later on. In my last episode, I also alluded to universal common ancestry. And so as a formal definition, universal common ancestry is the idea that all living organisms are related on Earth. And what's quite important here is the universal part. So there are multiple different kinds of evolution, and just there's multiple different kinds of evolution, there's also multiple different kinds of common ancestry. In the case of Darwinism or neo-Darwinism, what's often referred to as universal common ancestry is that everything comes from a single origin, right? And so this is different for something like, let's say, Lamarckian evolution. And Lamarck, for example, was a biologist who their contention mainly was with regards to, so they rejected universal common ancestry, but that doesn't believe that they rejected common ancestry in of itself. So just to be more clear here, what universal common ancestry is saying is that all specific organisms have one single origin. Now, in juxtaposition to that, you have someone like Lamarck, who is saying that the origin for this diversification is not necessarily a single entity, but it could be, or in their case, they argue that it is multiple different entities, right? So multiple origin events that leads to the diversification of all life. So it's important to note that evolution doesn't entail universal common ancestry as much as it does entail common ancestry. And so you can reject universal common ancestry and still uphold some mechanism of evolution or some overall theory of evolution. And what's often known as the tree of life, which is where you have one trunk, which is the single origin event, and then the multiple branches, which kind of symbolize the species, the genre, the phylum, and all those different taxonomic categorizations. And so the tree of life example is like very specific to the universal common ancestry example, because again, it shows that under universal common ancestry, humans, oak trees, bacteria, and butterflies, they're all kind of distinct cousins to one another. And if you go far back enough in time, you'll see that they all converge onto one trunk, which would be the single origin event. Now, it's also possible to consider the pattern separately from the process itself. So, like I said, someone might accept that all organisms share a common ancestor, but then they still might question the actual mechanism for how the diversification even happened in the first place. So that's where you can invoke different forms of evolution. So you can have, and this is an ongoing kind of field of research, someone like Dennis Noble, he would reject neo-Darwinism. And so he famously said neo-Darwinism is dead in a very recent publication that he's had. And so again, that goes to show that you can reject a particular form of evolution and still uphold universal common ancestry, or you can also uphold a particular notion of evolution and reject universal common ancestry. Like it's not mutually exclusive, and it's also not, there's no necessary entailment relation between the two. Now, I keep on mentioning mechanisms of evolution, right? So what really are those mechanisms? Now, separate from this pattern of common ancestry, what I mean by mechanism is that it's essentially that the modality in of itself that leads to speciation events, or that leads to changes in allele frequencies over time, right? And so that itself is defined in the literature as a mechanism. So in the case of neo-Darwinism, those mechanisms are random mutations in natural selection. Now, I'm sure some of you guys who've watched my last video can attest to what I mean by random mutation and kind of the philosophical implications that arise when you're saying random mutation, because you'd have to assume that randomness even exists in the first place. And so that's something that we'll touch on a bit more later on in not just this episode, but even in future episodes, that you can't really prove randomness. It's not something that necessarily exists in of itself, or there's no actual objective way you can deduce randomness. But like I said, that's one of the mainstream mechanisms in terms of neo-Darwinism that accounts for this diversity on Earth. There are a number of other kind of mutations, but the way it works is that these random genetic mutations occur within a particular organism. And you have these mutations occurring within an organism. Some of these mutations are either neutral, some of them are harmful, but occasionally some of them are also beneficial, in the sense that, let's say, for example, a mutation might help an animal run faster or perhaps digest food more efficiently. And so what natural selection does is that it selects those beneficial mutations that are more likely to survive and reproduce, or they allow the species to survive and reproduce. And by selecting on that mutation, it will carry on that mutation over to many other generations. And that's when you have a formal change in terms of the genome of that species. Now, like I said, there are also other mechanisms, especially when it comes to Darwinian evolution. And some of the evolutionists are still debating this significantly. But to simplify it, other mechanisms include genetic drift, which is random changes in terms of gene frequencies. And then there's also gene flow, which is the migration of genes between populations. And then there's also further taxonomies here, so that there's stuff like bottleneck effect or founder's effect. All of those things are, once again, mechanisms that are meant to account for the diversity of life on Earth. Now, the kind of critical question is whether these unguided natural processes are sufficient to account for all the complexity and all these new features that we see around us. In other words, can random mutation and selection create entirely new organs, novel body plans, and full variety of life from a single cell. Now, of course, the mainstream evolutionary view is yes, with the caveat that you give them enough time. And so they would invoke something called deep time when you have billions of years of evolution occurring. They will say that these kind of mechanisms could give an account to these novel body plans, these new productions of organs. Whereas people who are more skeptical of this mechanism or of evolution in terms of speciation events, they would argue that kind of change in selection, they lack the actual power to generate these complex features. And so we're not really going to get into it in this series, but perhaps in a future series, I'll be going over what I mean by complexity, in the sense that proponents like Michael Behe and other intelligent design proponents, they would argue that something as simple as, let's say, the flagellum of the bacteria, it's so robust and it's so sophisticated that it's not merely the case that you need to have so much information in order to produce those features, but that those features are deleterious in the sense that if it goes wrong or if it doesn't happen the right way, then you can't really form that flagella. So in the case of the bacterial flagella, Michael Behe notes that there's about 50 amino acids that code for that particular flagella. And that if even one of those amino acids are wrong or are deleterious, then you can't have any of the flagella. And so the idea here is that because you have, it's not merely the case that you have this high complexity of information that needs to exist, but also that you have to have this high complexity within one generation. Because if you had multiple generations, then again, it would be deleterious. And so again, we'll get into this a bit more kind of sophistication or bring more time into this topic. But this series in general is not really going to be touching much on the evidence of design. And instead, we'll be looking more on critiques of universal common ancestry, even within the genre of evolutionists themselves, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And just to finish off the slide, we can distinguish evidence from occurrence of evolution. So for example, fossil succession or genetic similarities, or what's known as homology, that those are often seen as suggesting common ancestry, but that evidence for evolution is very different from the actual of evolution in the sense that it's an unguided mutation. That selection mechanism, we can make it clear that in one case, we're looking at observable data, and in the other case, we're working with an assumption that best explains the observable data. And I went through this a lot more in my last episode, so if you guys are a bit confused, you should go back and go through that once again. Now, what this slide is going to be talking about is that there is a huge difference between science. When it comes to science, there's a huge difference between fact and theory, right? And so within scientific discussions, evolution, it's often said to be both a fact and a theory, but that seems convoluted and somewhat confusing, right? So to clarify, when someone says that evolution is both a fact theory, what they're implying is that these kind of small scale evolutionary changes, or what's known as microevolution, as I explained in the last slide, that is directly observed and it's directly measurable, and so therefore it's a fact. But when it comes to things that are like large scale evolution, such as common ancestry for all life, whether that be universal, whether that be a tree of life or a forest of life, or even if you're invoking multiple origin events, that in of itself is a theory, and you need observable data to test for that theory. So it's often another number of fallacies that occur in these discussions is that evolutionary proponents are willing to strong skeptics' views on evolution by saying that just because it's a theory doesn't mean it can't lead to facts, right? But it's very clear that the skeptic is not saying that evolution is a theory, but what they're saying is that universal common ancestry is a theory, right? So the interpretation you're using of the data, that of itself is a theory. And when people claim that evolution is, again, they're referring to these kind of undisputable observations, such as things like the bacteria developed antibody resistance, for example, right? Now, implicitly, they could also be asserting that the universal common ancestry notion of evolution is a fact. And once again, that's an equivocation, and that's not the way that logic dictates a discussion to go, right? So it's very important to note these things within the evolutionary background between the discourses that are happening, because that is essentially a category error, right? It's when someone's invoking a description of evolution, but then they're equivocating on that definition itself, right? So that is a category error. Now, what is intelligent design? So once again, we're not going to get too much into what intelligent design is and what's the evidence behind intelligent design, because a lot of that is really not meant for this series, but perhaps in a future series, we might go into it a bit further. Essentially, intelligent design is the view that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than undirected natural processes. ID proponents, or intelligent design proponents, they argue that we can detect the actions of an intelligent agent in aspects of biology. They would use evidence such as the intricate molecular machines in cells, or for example, the data that's found within DNA. They would argue that these things point to an intelligent designer and not really just blind chance, not these naturalistic processes. For example, the complexity of a cell's molecular motors, or let's just say the ribosome is a common example, that itself is very sophisticated and it's encoded in genetic material that can't really exist within a long time scale of events. It has to exist within a very short scale. They would argue that these things are so sophisticated and they must be there from the get-go to even explain everything else. Otherwise, it's deleterious. And therefore, that gives us credence to the fact that these things were intelligently designed. Now, once again, I'm not going to be going into this too much, but it may be in future episodes, perhaps even a future series, we'll break this down a bit further. Now, this slide really goes over what it means for evolution to be a religion. So it's often the case that evolution has become a religion. And what I mean by that is that just like religion, evolution has a number of proponents who use axiomatic assumptions to build their case, but those axiomatic assumptions are quite untestable. We'll have a future, I'm going to be literally titled, Is Universal Common Ancestry Testable? And we'll show that a lot of these presuppositions held by evolutionary biologists are truly testable in the sense that you can carry out an experiment and falsify them. Because of that, it's become a religion in the sense that these are your creedal points, so to say, and they're not falsifiable. There's also this accusation that ID proponents are religious. So intelligent design proponents are religious, but that's not the case. We also have multiple notions of non-classical theists as well as non-classical atheists who invoke some kind of intelligent life form that are the causative agents for design that we find in nature. There are some really good papers that have been recently published on this, and perhaps in the future episode, again, I might go ahead and extrapolate on those a bit further. Now, a very important thing to understand here is that there's this overarching kind of theme with all scientific discourses, and what that is basically is one's worldview, right? So the first of which is naturalism. And naturalism is the philosophy that nature is all there is and that there really are no supernatural beings or forces. And so what that means is that kind of everything that happens results from laws of physics, from chemistry, and from random chance. And someone who's like a strict naturalist, they would believe that phenomena like the origin of life and the complexity of organisms, it's not that they should, but it's that they must have purely come about from material explanations, right? Since again, they reject supernatural or non-natural forces or explanations. So for them, it must be the case that all the diversity on Earth or any of these miraculous events, or whether that be the spontaneous generation of a new organism, it must have been due to non-supernatural or blind processes, and it can't have arisen from something like a supernatural being. And theism, by contrast, what they would say is that theism as kind of a worldview, it would hold on to the belief that there's at least one deity or at least one supernatural mind who could create and intervene in the world. Theists believe that the natural world is not a closed system. An intelligent creator or designer could be behind the existence of the organization and the diversification of life. And that's really not quite unheard of either. A lot of theists claim that evolution has occurred, but it's been guided through some type of supernatural mind or some type of intelligent mind, right? And once again, that's very important to pinpoint because the worldview that you adopt depends significantly on your conclusions, right? So if you're looking at the evidence as a naturalist, you must automatically a priori dismiss all lines of thought that lead to some kind of supernatural event, right? Whereas as a theist, you would be more receptive and open to those events as an explanation that satisfies the overall evidence. And as a way to summarize, the way that naturalism occurs in science, it's essentially to assume that evolution must be unguided. It must have come about, or speciation events must have come about without any intervention from any supernatural source, but it must have been all through blind physical processes. And for the theist, it's that God could have intervened and produced these moments or these events that they would complement evolutionary mechanisms, but it's not necessarily the case that God must have. It could also be the case that God has just done it once and then just ignored creation altogether, but that gets to a lot of more complex mechanisms or theistic mechanisms of evolution. But yeah, just for the sake of simplicity, those are those two competing worldviews, and it's important to note that the way that you navigate this discussion, there's going to be a lot of these worldviews that you just kind of have to watch out for. Touching a bit more on science, now the definition of science is actually really important. Science is a system that's mostly defined as a systematic method of investigation through observation and testing, right? Now, by this standard, science it already has proven its worthiness, right? Science has achieved incredible success in terms of describing how the natural world works. And the way it does this is that it operates under this kind of overall rule called methodological naturalism, right? So I've already explained what naturalism was in the previous slide, but what methodological naturalism is that it's a principle that means that when you're doing science, researchers only consider natural causes and explanations. And in practice, no matter what phenomenon you're looking at, no matter what data you're interpreting, a scientist who is true to his work and his profession would be implementing methodological naturalism. And so therefore, he will look at the data for a cause that is in terms of something like physics or chemistry or biology, but he would never invoke an actual supernatural or intelligent deity as part of that scientific explanation. This isn't proved by science, it's just simply a rule that's often used within science. Now, methodological naturalism, the reason why it's there is because it restricts science to things that could be tested or observed, right? If you could just invoke any supernatural event, then it becomes unfalsifiable, pretty much. That's why this rule is there. Now, if scientists adopt a rule that only natural explanations are allowed, then the consequence is that the theory of unguided evolution automatically takes a privileged position in the debate of evolution. And so we'll flush this out furthermore, but what I'm implying here is that like design or creation is almost ruled out a priori, like from the get-go pretty much, not because the evidence debunks design, but because it's seen as a rule of thumb that whenever you're investigating science, you can't invoke anything non-natural, really. One really telling admiration here is one of the scientists, he says, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. And so what does this mean, right? So it means that even if the evidence for design are overwhelming, the framework of science, or as many kind of define it today, it would not allow us to conclude that design has occurred, because that conclusion lies outside the permitted kind of natural causes that the framework of science even allows for to begin with. And so this is really what methodological naturalism is. It's that evidence is filtered through a philosophy that says that we don't consider intelligence or the supernatural no matter what it is, right? And as we'll see in future episodes, this is a really important point to take into account, right? The first of which is that science is working under the assumption of methodological naturalism. And the second point is that not only is it working under methodological naturalism, but even when it comes to universal common ancestry, we will see that as well as merely a philosophy that's asserted a priori. It has no observational data behind it. It's really an inference that's being made, and it's based off of probabilistic events. For those who are confused about this, like I said, we'll touch more on this in future episodes, so stay tuned for that. Now, what I have here is another telling admiration, right? Professor Lyotin, what he says is that he makes a very clear statement here. He says very clearly that many scientists insist on materialistic or naturalistic explanations, even when those theories sound counterintuitive or even when the evidence itself is lacking, right? And he does this because he's saying that these scientists are quite committed to a particular philosophy, which in this case is materialism, right? And his famous quote, it reads, "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to our understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failures to fulfill many of the extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism." It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenon, but on the contrary, we are forced by our priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And so again, that particular last sentence is quite telling. We can't allow a divine foot in the door. And that really sums up the mindset that a lot of these scientists have when they're looking through the evidence and kind of sifting through what the data is saying. And so again, like I said, keep these in the back of your mind as we're exploring the evidence in future episodes. So given that what I've said before, there's a kind of controversial question that's quite lurking, right? Which is that, is evolution purely a scientific theory following the evidence wherever it leads, or is it taken as a characteristic of philosophy or ideology? I've already said that evolution is kind of seen as a religion, and this is not just me saying it, but there's multiple evolutionary biologists and philosophers who've said this as well, right? Microevolution, who is a philosopher of science and evolution, and so what he says is, evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. I am an advert evolutionist and an ex-Christian, but I must admit that this is one complaint, as the literalists are absolutely right. Evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning and is true of evolution still today. It has within itself a number of presuppositions and axioms, like creeds, that must be adopted, and that those who adhere to evolution see it as this dictating moral worldview in which they can base everything that they do off of that presupposition. And evolution is often sometimes assumed or presented as a worldview in of itself. And again, the idea is that it can replace religion because in of itself, it is a religion, right? So we'll be flushing out a lot of the stuff in future episodes again, but this is really just to prime you for what the discussions are going to be like in the future. Now, an important kind of framework or important aspect or property of scientific theories is really their falsifiability, right? So there must be some possible evidence that could, if found, show to falsify the theory. Now, if a theory is so flexible that it can accommodate any and all kinds of data, then it becomes unfalsifiable, and it really just becomes dogma, right? Rather than like actual empirical science. And so evolution is really no different, right? If you kind of look at the evidence that we'll be looking at in future episodes, as well as the philosophy behind evolution, you'll see that it's actually really hard to falsify it. Like I said before, we'll have an entire episode on testing universal common ancestry, but you should just know this just in the subconscious level, you should know that when it comes to evolution, it's often paired with these auxiliary presuppositions or these auxiliary assumptions, and that when you go to test the actual universal common descent, and let's just say you get theory that's false, or you get an observation that isn't predicted by universal common ancestry, what evolutionists will do is that they will just falsify the auxiliary presuppositions, but they will never truly falsify the actual universal common descent aspect of the theory. And in that sense, universal common ancestry becomes somewhat protected by these auxiliary hypotheses. And essentially, it just becomes way too flexible. And we'll know some of the examples of this in future episodes. But yeah, just stay tuned for all that. Now, there is a philosopher of science known as Karl Popper, and he's very influential. And really, anyone who's looked into evolution and the philosophy of science, there's really no need to introduce who Karl Popper is. But he says that, so initially, he essentially doubts that Darwinian evolution was a testable scientific theory at all. And he says that it's, quote, not a testable scientific theory, but a metaphysical research program. And so what he meant was that evolution, especially the way that we're talking about it right now, he meant that it seems to be all too encompassing and it's too flexible of a theory. And so because of that, there's really no way to truly falsify it. And we'll be going over some of his critiques later on in future episodes, but it's quite telling to note that this is not just one admiration from the camp of the intelligent design proponents, but this is also something that's highly repeated by those even within the evolutionary camp themselves. And just as a summary, these are some of the major points that we've defined the major terms that we have gone and extrapolated on their definitions. And this should serve as a helpful blueprint for when I'm talking about some of the things that I do talk about in future episodes.